Hello, friends. Welcome to the first Friends of Park County podcast. For our inaugural podcast, we'll be discussing land use, that is, where and how we grow, and water use. Water, of course, being in our Constitution a property of we the people. More specifically, we'll be talking about the intersection, the linkages between water use and land use. I'm Randy Carpenter, Friends of Park County Executive Director. Friends of Park County is focused on a single issue. How do we manage growth in a way that protects our most precious assets, our water, our agricultural land, and our wildlife habitat? We could see what could be in our future just by looking west to the Gallatin Valley, sprawling subdivisions, disappearing wildlife habitat and farmland, and dwindling water supplies. The polling that we in Park County Environmental Council and surveys done by the Park County Community Foundation show that people overwhelmingly care deeply about the water and the land and want to find ways to protect these precious assets. So, how is land use and water use linked? And why is understanding that link so important? And why is advocating for sensible policy so crucial to the future of Park County? When we asked experts in our great state who is best equipped to answer those questions, we heard again and again, you need to talk to this guy from Upper Missouri Waterkeeper, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting and improving the ecological and aesthetic quality of the Upper Missouri water basin for present and future generations. So I'm delighted to say that our guy is here today, and his name is actually Guy. Guy Alsentzer is the Upper Missouri Waterkeeper's executive director, and he and his staff earlier this year won a resounding water rights victory that directly and significantly protects water rights in the state and has resulted in less rural sprawl, which protects our land and water. Guy, welcome.
Hello, glad to be here.
So you've repeatedly stressed that water use and land use are linked. Why do you say that?
Well, I think of it from this idea that first and foremost, ecological connectivity, but secondly, we as humans tend to think in terms of utility. And what utility does land have if we as humans can't use it? And most of the uses to which we put land require water. So whether we're talking about being able to drink for residences or flush the proverbial toilet, whether we're talking about the amenities that come from our outdoors heritage, or whether it comes from this idea of economic development, something that drives people to come here to spend their resources or to live here, it's all centered around the connectivity of water. And that's both good quality water and readily available water.
Are our water supplies dwindling across the state, especially fast-growing areas and in Park County?
So I think there's an important nuance that listeners should gather, which is in Montana, we have both administratively and legislatively closed river basins. And what that means is we have a system of water rights where you may have heard the adage, first in time, first in right. And the long and short of that is in many places, we already have too many proverbial straws in the cup.
Yeah. That
when you think of it from a very broad spectrum, zooming out to the 30,000 foot level, and you're talking about entire river systems, we actually have, if not a quantification of how much water under the ground and surface collectively is there, but we have in terms of an understanding on paper of how much water ought to be used and should be allocated to particular uses with particular timing. And when you add those up, we start talking about, well, is there really enough to go around?
Right.
And this is much different from the practical reality of you buy a 5-acre lot and you want to drill your well and you're using, your daily average of some 300 to 400 gallons a day. You may well have water there, but that's radically different from this idea of do you have the legal right to use that water? Because once we start thinking about it, the old adage, when I think about 10th grade science, when you start adding this all up, and you start thinking about how many straws are in the proverbial cup. If there's too many straws at a certain time in a certain place in a valley, and there's not enough water to go around, you start to have others that already have a right that have been existing. They start to lose out on that right. Now, we just went down the rabbit hole, but I think the big concept here is to think about who has a legal right, and then separate from the legal right to use something, is there actually water physically available?
Yeah, I mean, I have always understood that senior water rights holders, say it goes back to 1870, that they'll always have water and they don't have to worry about new people wanting more of that water. Is that not the case?
Well, you're going to throw us right into the deep end. And I think
Yeah.
this is one of the great crucibles of the population boom in Montana. That when we talk about growth, Montana's prodigious growth, unprecedented growth,
That's right.
particularly in certain river valleys, many of which are these, quote, closed basins, right? So we have, in terms of law, no new water rights available. So you can't apply to the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation to get a new water right for any purpose in these administratively or legislatively closed basins. And let's make this very clear. In the Gallatin, for example,
Yeah.
it's part of the Missouri Headwater Subbasin. This is all closed to new surface water rights. So it means we have a legally closed universe, if you will, where you could sell a water right. You could potentially buy one if there's an offer out there. But the nuance is that you can't secure anything new to add to the paper water rights out there. Now, your question comes down to this idea of, are senior water rights actually protected? And I would offer the big threat is that we have many exceptions to the rule. And when we start to have exceptions to the rule, how do you start to quantify those? And at what point do we have this sliding scale? Is there a way to understand when the exception swallows the rule and threatens not only your legal right, but the practical utilities to which we as humans and existing landowners have already put that water to use, right? So when you ask, are senior water rights actually protected? I would offer, until a recent court case, arguably not, from the threat of prospective sprawl development.
So tell us about that court case.
So Upper Missouri Waterkeeper is a 501c3 water advocacy organization.
Yeah.
We're fundamentally focused much on not just protecting our membership, but also this mission of saying, what does it mean to have a healthy river system?
Yeah.
And what does it also mean to serve community health? For us, our mission and strategic plan recognizes that these are connected resources, that it's not just protecting the intrinsic value of a river and or the wildlife, but it's also about understanding and protecting that community and those amenities that the community depends upon. Now, the way in which our court case, which was decided last February 2024, came about was that we have members that are generational ranchers living on the eastern shores of Canyon Ferry. And these are generational ranchers. These are people that make their living off of the land. But they're also people that are concerned by sound governance. And this idea of, at least around Canyon Ferry, you have much of, I would offer the rumblings of major development proposals coming out of the prolonged population boom in the Helena Valley. And while Townsend, you might say, oh, I drive through Townsend. I don't really think of Townsend when I think of a population boom. But then you think about Canyon Ferry, you think about the belts, right? You think about the wildlife, you think about it as just a recreational amenity. It certainly is beautiful and inspiring landscape. And what we saw there was a proposal to put a major new subdivision of trophy homes up on the hill, right on the shores of Canyon Ferry. And it was surrounded in its entirety by senior water rights and existing agricultural ranchers. There, those members reached out when they saw, the proverbial notice in the paper, got the certified letter and said, what the heck is this? How could you put a suburb of trophy homes right in between our existing agricultural land uses?
Well, wait a minute. If those senior water rights holders, again, are protected, how could there be a subdivision that would be planting dozens of wells, taking water out of that basin? I don't quite get it.
So we should really peel back the layer of the onion when we talk about how can somebody, if they buy let's just say in the Horse Creek Hills was the case.
Sure.
That one was a roughly 400-acre parcel. And then people were going to break it up into roughly 5 to 10 acre slices, plus, of course, a 20 or 30 acre spot for some commercial development, because you need a gas station to supply that subdivision. In that case, when we're talking about how do you make sure that the senior water rights are protected, well, the law says within the basin, it's a closed basin, so no new surface water rights. So what they proposed here was to say, well, we would use what in Montana is called the exempt well loophole. Now, the exempt well loophole stands for the proposition that back in the heyday when we actually had homesteads, an average person could go out and they could sink a well. And that was considered a, quote, de minimis use of water.
Seems appropriate.
It seems
fine.
Appropriate. Sure. Your
Stock
family.
tank, whatever.
Yep. A de minimis use. What we have realized since the creation of this de minimis loophole, this exempt well, is that it has been crafted legislatively to now become something that was a creature that helped quench the insatiable thirst of subdivisions, which are radically different in character than what we had talked about with this idea of a homestead. So think about it from the perspective of 1890s Montana. Think about the pragmatism that was in much of the state up until probably the 1950s and 60s. And then we think about how after our industries, in terms of the mining industry and the timber industry, largely had their boom and bust cycles. In the 80s, what did Montana start to do? We held ourselves out as a natural resource amenity, but it was much more based upon this idea of recreation and or come here because it's a good place to live. Now the bill has come due because every time you want to build, particularly large commercial scale, residential scale development, how do you do that when technically there's no new water available?
Right.
And in the case of Horse Creek Hills, there wasn't even a conversation about buying somebody's water right. It was about saying, how can we maximize the exception to the rule? Which is to say, how do we use a number of different exempt wells? And then how do we move forward to use this idea of just looking at the property, just having our guaranteed property right to sink our wells without considering the off-site impacts? And this is the tension in Montana that until recently was largely the field of the technocrats, right? The bureaucrats in the agencies would talk about it. The conservation professionals like myself would talk about it. Lawyers in their boardrooms would talk about it. But I don't think the bill really came due in terms of figuring out how do we reconcile these statutes and legal demands about how and where do you develop land use at the county level, and then this completely different context, or so people thought, about, well, I have a senior water right and somebody wants to build a subdivision next to me. What are the tools in my tool belt to make sure that their use and build out is not going to affect me? Which sounds very pragmatic and reasonable. And yet, up until this year, I would argue, the vast majority of Montana was not following a thoughtful process for evaluating how do we consider not just what the subdivision itself will do, can it have water for its people, but what does their use of that land, including water in particular, mean off-site on your neighbors?
So what I'm gathering, though, is that if there's an exempt well loophole, so one well, what is that, 10 acre feet?
10 acre feet a year, 35 gallon per minute average.
Okay. So if you're below that, you don't, you get this loophole, you got an exempt well.
Correct.
But if you've got a subdivision that comes in and each one of those homes has that well, wouldn't they exceed that limit?
Yeah.
I mean, because they're drawing from the same water source.
Correct. So this is where some of the technicality comes in about the court battles that have happened for the last 20 years. And the Horse Creek Hills case in Broadwater County that my organization prevailed was the most recent iteration. But before that, there were several different battles. And I think the most notable highlights for the listener is to understand that, first and foremost, we labored under the misassumption for many, many, many decades in Montana that groundwater and surface water were not connected.
Yeah.
So we thought about, oh, I can plug a well wherever I want, and we don't have to evaluate it in terms of the qualitative impacts on wildlife or what have you in a nearby river, but we also don't have to look at it from a legal context about senior water rights. Well, that ended in the early 2000s. The Supreme Court said, look, this is bogus. There's no scientific basis for this. Instead, we need to consider this under essentially a unitary theory, which is the vast majority of Montana river valleys are shallow alluvial aquifer. It feeds into and is connected to our rivers.
Sure, of course. Just makes sense.
But it took us a long time to establish that. So that happened in the early 2000s. The next step was that we started to see rampant development pressure both before the Great Recession and after. And where that really culminated was in another test case called Clark Fork Coalition v. Tubbs. And that was in 2014. And the Supreme Court there took issue with this idea that developers were using a different loophole, which was to say you can plumb, as you put it, Randy, innumerable different wells on your subdivision, and so long as they were not physically connected to each other in terms of the piping, well, they're each an exempt well. But what did that do? Well, that created essentially a nonsensical outcome where each one of them could be withdrawing, and it was greater than the actual de minimis allocation put in law. So if you have, let's just say 400 homes and they're each having a well for this amount, but they're not physically connected, it was an artifice of law that made no sense as applied, because
That's crazy.
You could be sucking up enormous quantities of water. And again, what is the impact? Well, number one, you wouldn't know. But number two, often there were agricultural users or senior water rights right next to you, or a nearby trout stream. Long story short, the Supreme Court said, this arbitrary idea of are your pipes actually connected doesn't mean that you can evade this basic concept of saying, look, there's a cap in terms of what an exempt well represents. So when we say the term exempt well, it's more about a quantity of water.
Gotcha.
So fast forward to the Horse Creek Hills case. Now we're another decade later, and it's an even more blatant and egregious use of the, quote, exempt well loophole. This time, it's not about whether or not the pipes for these individual wells were connected, but rather this quite egregious statement that we deserve multiple exempt wells, that our commercial lot for the prospective gas station deserves an exempt well, that we can have several different phases of development, and each phase of development,
it's all one development,
and yet there's different phases that are going to come out, right? Because we want to get a return on investment. We want to do a couple parcels over here, and then another 2 years later we're going to do another couple parcels. But the logic was, well, each phase of the development can now get its own exempt well. Well, guess what? This one got up to the courts again, and it makes no sense, because the law clearly says a single exempt well is 1 10-acre foot a year, or 35 gallon per minute average. That's it. No more. That's it. And when you start looking at what happened in the case, it was fundamentally about this friction between an insatiable growth, that it's not economical to develop subdivisions based upon exempt wells. And why is that? Because it's not enough water to go around. And this is setting aside the policy implications of essentially having, I would offer, a house of cards, where we're looking at, wait a minute, we're in Montana. We're a headwater state. We know that we're a snowpack economy, but we're also snowpack based in terms of our livelihoods. And we know that that's increasingly speculative in terms of how much we get, how long it lasts into the field season. And we also know that we don't have enough to go around as it is. And yet we have some of the most high-stakes building pressure ever seen in the Northern Rockies, centered right in our backyards in southwest Montana. And what does that really mean when we start talking about land use and these old statutory constructs or counties looking at development? I would offer this is where the rubber meets the road. When you say to me when we started this podcast, why is land use and water connected? I would offer that the number one thing that Montanans feel time and again in my conversations is that they feel like they're losing pieces of their outdoors heritage, that they feel like they're disenfranchised and disconnected from the actual decision-making process, and feeling increasingly that we have no tools in our tool belt. And I would offer that the tool in your tool belt as a citizen to actually get engaged and influence how and where we develop is your ability as a citizen to talk about and engage with your decision makers about, do we have enough of our natural amenities, in fact, to allow reasonable build out that's not a race to the bottom?
You know, I got on a DNRC website, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, a state agency, to look at some applications for a change in water use and try and in Park County and try and understand that. And no pun intended, but it's really murky. I mean, I just
it's arcane.
It's arcane, and I just couldn't figure out what this change of use meant, who was applying for it, who is this LLC, where's the water coming from. That doesn't seem fair in a state that prides itself for having transparency in our governance.
Well, I would offer that when we talk about water rights in particular and changes of use, which is to say, for the lay out there, if we're talking about a change of use, or what we're really meaning is somebody has likely sold their water right, or they've bought one and they want to use it for a different purpose. And this goes back to the basic principle that you started this podcast on, which is the state in the public trust owns the water, but people can have a legal right to use it in a particular way for a beneficial use. And so long as you stay within your beneficial use, and that's a term of art, then you have a legal right to use water, but you don't own the water. You own the right to use the water.
So if you're changing that beneficial use from irrigation to a subdivision, there's a process there.
There's a process
that I would argue is very hard to understand.
It is hard to understand, and I want to be very clear. There are mechanisms to engage in that process, but that does not mean it's easy. It is esoteric, it is arcane, and unless you have either a law degree or a fascination with legalese and hydrology, it will probably be difficult to engage. I would offer that the other opportunity for citizens to understand this idea of looking up what's happening in your backyards and understanding the lay of the land, as it were, is to also bird dog the heck out of what the heck is coming through your county. Because this is probably the greatest single outcome in a positive sense for citizenry after the Horse Creek Hills case in Broadwater County, which is a declaratory judgment from the court applicable across the state that said, look, the burden is not just on the applicant to sufficiently assess what are going to be the probable impacts of this new speculative development and subdivision. And by the way, let's be very clear, anyone that wants to develop land, they have an affirmative burden on them to actually evaluate off-site impacts, including water resources, on the surrounding community, adjacent neighbors, wildlife, what have you. So that's a big change because often those are considered rubber stamp exercises.
Right.
Now, in addition to that is a second layer of review. And that's what is the incumbent on county commission and the planning folks.
So that's the primary review criteria in our subdivision regulations. Is
Correct.
that right? What's the impact on wildlife, wildlife habitat, local services, and water?
Correct.
And irrigation water as
Correct.
well. Okay. So our local governments have to review subdivisions for the impacts on those assets.
And I would offer that it's not just a mentioning it and then relegating it to the filing cabinet, that there's actually great terms built into the law. And I'll offer this. What does the phrase specific, documentable, and clearly defined impact, unquote, mean to you?
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, I would offer your common sense understanding of it is just as good as the courts, which is to say it means there needs to be a robust documentation of what the heck is being proposed and where are the impacts going to be in terms of characterizing them, quantifying them, and qualifying them.
You know, Guy, I've been a planner for 30-some years, and that documentable evidence that you talk about is not always the most robust when it comes to reviewing new subdivisions in my experience. How does that happen? How does the developers keep getting away with that? It's kind of hard to understand.
I would offer that the most basic, it's because we, the people, are not demanding accountability.
Okay.
That's where it needs to stop and start. That we live in a democracy. The legislature has vested citizens with powerful tools in their tool belt to help influence decision-making processes as regards new speculative development, land use, what have you, with subdivisions. We, the people, have not consistently exercised the very clear tools that we have, but I would offer that this is probably one of the most important things that we can do. It's up there with changing the oil in your truck every 4,000 miles. You should be doing this and engaging, because if you do not, this is how it's a roll tide in the worst way, that developers come in with a lot of gravitas. They come in with a lot of money. They come in with voluminous technical records and attorneys.
Right.
But what's at stake is our outdoors heritage. What's at stake is not just your ability to turn on your faucet. It's also your ability to see your neighbors that may be the rancher down the way that has 50 head of cattle and he grows alfalfa. But if he goes away, not only is that water use going to change, but it's also going to dramatically affect, in an indirect way, the ecological characteristics of everything we care about. Sure. And let me offer this. When we think about the Gallatin Valley, much less the Shields Valley, what are some of the characteristics that make it so notable and spectacular? I would offer it's the wildlife amenities that are part of our public trust. And why do the wildlife come there? Because of the open spaces, because of the forage, because of the water resources, because of the shelter. Right? We lose these things and we experience fragmentation, and the way to connect the dots in terms of understanding how and where we grow. And to be clear, this is not a silver bullet, but this is about saying, how do we have meaningful tools in our tool belt to understand how and where we grow and to influence that in a thoughtful way? Just like democracy, the Montana Subdivision and Platting Act is not perfect. It's messy, but it is a powerful tool to demand upfront an affirmative burden on the developer and our county commission to tell us what are going to be the impacts when you allow a new 400 lot subdivision out in the hinterlands. And what does that actually mean on the neighbor, on the nearby water resource, on the wildlife? And guess what? If there are going to be burdensome negative impacts that are been documented with science. County decision makers have the legal right to deny it. They don't have to just approve it. You don't have to immediately go to, well, we can't stop it. We just have to mitigate. I would offer, no, that's not the right lens. That when we have the overwhelming evidence showing that it's not a good fit, the county has an obligation to deny it. And to the extent that they shirk their duties to evaluate the impacts and don't come to a reasoned decision, those are subject to being overturned. And so how does that actually happen? Well, I would say it's not going to happen without citizens getting engaged and standing up for the things they care about, including their neighbors.
And help from groups like Upper Missouri Waterkeeper. I mean, it's please tell me that you have a staff of several hundred attorneys looking into all of this.
Unfortunately not, Randy. And I think one of the items that folks should get in terms of a context is that Waterkeeper, my organization, works throughout a 5-county area.
Okay.
That's roughly 24,000 square miles. So we're the Missouri River itself, but think of all the headwaters that feed it. So this is all your classic trout streams, of course, but this is also some of the biggest high growth areas in the Northern Rockies. And what we do, which is unique, and I think perhaps is a good roadmap for others to think about.
Yeah.
On a week or bi-weekly basis, we review decision-making proposals that have to be publicly noticed from the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, which is essentially your agency that's in charge of qualitative issues. We have to look at all the industrial and commercial use permits. We look at all the county different land use permits in terms of what is being proposed where. We look at your board of supervisors and or your 310 permits that come out from your county commission or sometimes shared authority with the conservation district. And we review, of course, the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. And that's all separate and apart from what EPA does. But this is perhaps what we do that's somewhat unique and may sound very overwhelming to others. But I think the good news is that investing in local advocates and getting engaged doesn't mean you're on your own. It means understanding that there are organizations and entities and often your neighbors that we all care about the same values. And what it really comes down to is how do we build our own community of common interests, and how do we respectfully but also consistently stand up and demand accountability from our decision makers to protect the values we all care about. And I would offer those values. It's our water, it's our wildlife, it's our Western way of life. And it's not about rolling over for any new development proposal because of the specious money it's going to bring. Rather, it has to be about thoughtful decision making that protects our values first and foremost. And
Preach, man.
That's what the law requires, but that's what we, the people, have to stand up for as well.
And that's what we at Friends of Park County, advocate for and are working on. And it's so fantastic to have a partner like Upper Missouri Waterkeeper on this crucial issue of the future of our communities. I do want to explore this link just a little bit more between land use and water use because having been, a city planner for numerous cities, and I'm actually, as a little side job, the city planner for the city of Three Forks. And that's a growing city. And water rights and acquiring water rights is an expensive and onerous process. And I know that's the same thing for Bozeman and Livingston and communities across Montana. So they don't get loopholes. They don't get exempt wells to supply water. But if there are or were loopholes out in rural areas, it seems like that would incentivize rural development. Hey, we get this water through any loopholes when cities have to work really hard and spend a lot of money, rightfully so, to get their water. So it seems like it would just encourage sprawl doing it that way. Do I have that right?
Unfortunately, I think you do, Randy. One of the interesting vignettes that we should just nip in the bud here is that the last two legislatures in particular have unfortunately put forward a number of different land use bills that have tried to radically reshape what is the process for developing in the county.
Yeah.
And they've tried to streamline it. Now, I would offer from our perspective at Waterkeeper, much of it was cloaked a wolf in sheep's clothing, where it was saying this is about affordability. But this wasn't actually about affordability. If it was about affordability, we would have state law ability to do inclusionary zoning and deed restrictions to create affordability. Yeah. But that's not what we're here to talk about. I would say that the side effect of opening up the floodgates in terms of making the bar quite low and allowing per se legal entitlement to landowners to subdivide in county areas, it has disproportionate negative impacts that are externalized in two respects. Number one, they're externalized specifically upon municipalities, because if it's fundamentally cheaper, and when I say cheaper, significantly cheaper to build housing in the county than it is in a municipality, as a pure return on your investment, many people are going to seek that opportunity first. But number two, it's also externalizing the costs of that development. And I would offer that we need to be very judicious about how and where we, as a public policy in our legislature, should be incentivizing this. Generally speaking, you as a land use planner, myself as one who's taken the survey course in grad school but has worked in the field, I would offer that sprawl development really benefits no one except for the developer that flips those properties. It really detracts from the land use amenity. It detracts in very tangible, often economical ways in terms of our wildlife. It detracts in terms of services that are burdened upon ratepayers to have to pay for the infrastructure. And there's far more cost-effective ways to actually pay for those costs. And that's usually developing within a city, within a municipal boundary, and using centralized services and guaranteed water resources in particular. One of the things that's most, perhaps from to get back to the water in particular, that's really concerning to me about this idea of speculative development in the county and how the legislature has opened up the floodgates, made it easy in terms of sewer permitting, in terms of water right exemptions, in terms of the prerogative to lessen the burden, even under the Subdivisions and Platting Act, for small-scale development. The thing that really strikes us at Waterkeeper is that, again, going back to that Supreme Court case in the early 2000s that said groundwater and surface water is connected, we don't have, in Montana, as many know, we don't have a guaranteed in-stream flow, right? So many of our namesake rivers that, if you're new off the boat, or even if you've been here for multiple generations, rivers can get sucked dry legally. And that's a damn shame.
By August, September, they literally
can be sucked
a tributary doesn't reach the main stem.
And that's because in many different parts of the state, there are more water rights than we have available. And I would offer that when you overlay this idea of scarcity, which is there's already not enough to go around, with the idea of the undisputed truth of our climate is changing. We have a variable snowpack in particular. We have less to go around during the times of year when people use it the most. What that really means when we talk about a subdivision coming in, particularly these 100-lot mega subdivisions, they have such a high demand during those times of year that it exacerbates these ongoing ills, right? These ideas of the cumulative impacts across a valley. And why that's so troubling is that it's not just about disenfranchising in a senior water right or a generational rancher, but it's about undermining our outdoors heritage and our Western way of life, which is predicated, in my opinion, on fairness, on a sense of being neighborly, and in a sense of saying sometimes it's not the right place or the right time to simply sell it off to the highest bidder, that in fact we need to be more judicious and less mercurial in terms of prioritizing the public's trust in protecting those critical headwaters and protecting some modicum of water in our streams so we don't lose our keynote wildlife, and for making sure that we're not just having land for the highest bidder. But unfortunately, the way in which our legislature has been amending rules is going the exact opposite, which is to say making it easier to develop outside the municipalities. So if there was ever an unconventional bedfellow amongst the conservation community or concerned folks that Friends of Park County, you care about what's happening in your backyards, you want to connect the dots, I would offer this is the time and place to develop those unconventional bedfellow relationships and to think about, don't rural landowners and senior water right owners and large folks that own large tracts of land, don't you actually have a lot to talk about over coffee with your local city commission? Don't you actually have a lot to say about how do we fix some of the broken wheels in our machinery of land use? And likewise, where do we all need to have some solidarity in terms of saying, let's draw some lines in the sand and protect what's clean and healthy and provides public amenities. And at the same time, let's make sure that we're developing in a thoughtful way where it can be appropriate and we're not having those negative rippling effects on your neighbors, on the outdoors, on our local economy even.
Well, just fantastic stuff, Guy. Every time I talk to you, I gain a new understanding and deeper understanding of how we make it easier and cheaper to grow in places that have the most impact on the things that we care about the most. And that's why so many folks like me were just so delighted about your resounding victory in the Broadwater case. So regarding that and regarding exempt wells, where do we go from here? We've got a legislature coming up. I tuned into a working group on exempt wells that was broadcast over Zoom. I got to tell you, I couldn't understand what they were talking about. It was so technical. They didn't do an intro of why this is important, where in framing the issue. They just started talking about stuff that was way over my head, and I think most people's head. So where do we go from here? What's going to happen in the legislature, for instance?
Oh, that's a grim crystal ball as a conservationist. The development, the pressure to develop land is overwhelming. I think one of the probably most helpful things anybody could do if you want to wet your whistle on where do we go from here is to read the conclusion of Judge McMahon in the Broadwater case.
Yes,
and that's available on our website. You can scroll to the end. It's a 78-page order, and the last 2 pages are quite probing and I think really thoughtful. And to paraphrase Judge McMahon, he says the pressure to development land is unrelenting and overwhelming, and he foresees a reality where there will continue to be political-based decisions that incentivize sprawl development in our valleys and all the externalities of that, which is to say all the consequences of this myopic vision saying the only thing we're looking at is what's happening on that particular subdivision. We're not looking at the cumulative impacts on any of the resource criteria offsite. Right. That will continue unabated unless something change. And while the case was great in terms of saying there is an affirmative burden on county development to do its homework and in fact to deny where it needs to be denied, that's not a silver bullet to solving the problem. Because so long as Montana remains an awesome place, which I think it is, and I do encourage people to come here, but we need to make sure that we have attention and a comity of purpose about saying we as a society, particularly embodied through the legislative power, which is we the people, we need to be coming up with meaningful solutions that do not represent a race to the bottom for our outdoors heritage and for our existing legal rights. And the solution is not just to say, well, they're inconvenient to the reality that we need to develop, baby. We shouldn't just be getting rid of those rules. Instead, we should be putting our heads down and figuring out what's a meaningful solution, not expanding loopholes, but instead saying there's got to be a smarter, less hurtful way to develop and allow people to have a roof over their heads in Montana.
Fantastic. Guy, I hope we keep working together. Again, I learn more every time I talk to you. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Would appreciate if you make sure that you like and subscribe to us on social media, friendsofparkcounty.org. You can find this podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, I'd like to thank our supporters who make our work possible. We are deeply grateful for you. And until the next podcast, have a good day. Thank you.